Welcome to FactUp Realm, where we explore the profound questions that shape our world. In this video, we delve into the intricate relationship between democracy and dictatorship, questioning the true nature of freedom in modern governance. As we journey through history, philosophy, and contemporary challenges, we'll uncover the hidden dynamics at play in global politics today. Prepare to rethink what you know about democracy and dictatorship. In the complex and interconnected world of the 21st century, the concepts of democracy, dictatorship, and freedom are more relevant than ever. These ideas, which have shaped societies for centuries, are now facing unprecedented challenges. Globalization, technological advancement, economic disparities, and political polarization have transformed the landscape in which these systems operate. As we navigate this new world, it becomes essential to revisit and critically examine these concepts, understanding not only their historical foundations but also their present manifestations and future possibilities. This exploration will delve into the philosophical underpinnings of democracy and dictatorship, tracing their evolution through history and analyzing their roles in shaping human freedom and societal order today. By understanding the dynamics of these systems, we can better grasp the implications of current global trends and potentially anticipate the directions in which our world might be heading. To engage in a meaningful discussion of democracy and dictatorship, it is essential first to define these terms clearly. While democracy is often heralded as the pinnacle of governance, providing a framework where power is derived from the people, the concept is far more complex than this simplistic definition suggests. Similarly, dictatorship, commonly associated with authoritarian rule and the suppression of freedoms, has nuances that must be understood to fully appreciate its various forms. Democracy can be defined as a system of government in which power is vested in the people, who rule either directly or through freely elected representatives. At its core, democracy is about collective decision-making, where the voices of the majority guide the direction of society. However, this definition alone does not capture the full spectrum of democratic governance. For example, liberal democracy, the most prevalent form today, emphasizes the protection of individual rights, the rule of law, and the separation of powers within the government. Direct democracy, on the other hand, involves the direct participation of citizens in decision-making processes, a concept rooted in ancient Greek political systems. Dictatorship, by contrast, is characterized by the concentration of power in the hands of a single ruler or a small group. This concentration often leads to the suppression of political dissent, the curtailing of individual freedoms, and the absence of free and fair elections. However, the term dictatorship covers a wide range of governance systems, from military juntas to totalitarian regimes and even some autocratic democracies where elections exist but are manipulated to ensure the continued rule of the dictator. Freedom is perhaps the most contested of these terms, with interpretations varying widely depending on the context. In a democratic society, freedom is generally understood as the ability of individuals to act according to their own will, within the bounds of the law, without undue interference from the government. This includes freedoms such as speech, assembly, and the press. In a dictatorship, freedom is often restricted, with the state exercising control over many aspects of life. However, some dictatorships may claim to offer a different form of freedom from chaos, instability, or external threats, justifying their concentration of power as necessary for the greater good. Understanding these definitions provides a foundation for the more in-depth exploration that follows, as we examine how these concepts have evolved and how they interact in the modern world. The roots of democracy and dictatorship stretch back to ancient times, with the most notable early example of democracy being found in ancient Athens. Here, democracy was practiced through a system of direct participation, where citizens, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners, would gather to make decisions on public policy and laws. This form of government, though limited in its inclusivity, laid the groundwork for modern democratic thought. In contrast to Athens, ancient Rome provides an early example of a republic, where power was held by elected representatives and an appointed senate. However, as Rome transitioned from republic to empire, it also offers an example of how a democracy can devolve into dictatorship. figures like Julius Caesar and Augustus effectively ended the Roman Republic, concentrating power in their hands and establishing a precedent for future autocrats. The Middle Ages saw the decline of democratic practices, with monarchies and feudal systems dominating much of Europe. It wasn't until the Enlightenment that democratic ideas began to resurface, spurred by philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued for the rights of individuals and the concept of a social contract. These ideas laid the intellectual groundwork for the revolutions of the 18th century, particularly in America and France, where new forms of democratic governance were established. The 19th and 20th centuries saw the spread of democracy across the globe, often in conjunction with the decline of colonialism and the rise of nation-states. However, this period also witnessed the rise of totalitarian regimes, particularly in the early 20th century, as seen in Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Stalinist Russia. These regimes, though initially emerging in democratic contexts, quickly morphed into some of the most repressive dictatorships in history. Totalitarianism represents the most extreme form of dictatorship, where the state seeks to control every aspect of life, often through propaganda, surveillance, and brutal repression. The totalitarian regimes of the 20th century provide stark examples of how quickly democratic systems can be subverted when power is concentrated in the hands of a few. This historical overview sets the stage for a deeper exploration of how these systems function in the modern world, particularly as we look at the challenges facing contemporary democracies and the emergence of new forms of dictatorship. As we transition from the historical roots of democracy and dictatorship to their modern forms, it is essential to examine how these systems function in today's world. The 21st century has seen both the triumphs and the challenges of democracy, as well as the persistence of dictatorial regimes, albeit often in more subtle or disguised forms. Modern democracies, while widely regarded as the ideal form of governance, face significant challenges that threaten their stability and effectiveness. Among these challenges are populism, political polarization, and the erosion of democratic norms. Populism. In recent years, populist movements have gained traction in many democracies around the world. These movements often position themselves as the voice of the common people against a corrupt elite, but they can also undermine democratic institutions by promoting simplistic solutions to complex problems. Populism often exploits economic and social grievances, leading to increased polarization and a weakening of democratic consensus. Political polarization. Another major challenge is the growing political polarization in many democracies. As societies become more divided along ideological lines, compromise becomes more difficult, and the political process can become gridlocked. This polarization is often exacerbated by social media and the echo chambers it creates, where individuals are exposed only to information that reinforces their existing beliefs. Erosion of democratic norms. Perhaps the most insidious challenge facing modern democracies is the gradual erosion of democratic norms. This can occur when leaders, elected through democratic processes, begin to undermine the very institutions that sustain democracy. Examples include attempts to weaken the judiciary, restrict press freedom, or manipulate electoral processes to entrench power. To better understand these challenges, it is useful to examine specific cases where democratic erosion has occurred. Countries such as Hungary, Turkey, and Venezuela offer examples of how democratically elected leaders have gradually concentrated power, leading to a decline in democratic practices and freedoms. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has used his time in office to consolidate power, weaken the judiciary, and control the media. While elections still occur, the political playing field is heavily tilted in favor of Orbán and his party, raising concerns about the true democratic nature of the state. Turkey has seen a similar trend under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Initially elected as a reformer, Erdogan has increasingly moved toward authoritarianism, particularly following a failed coup attempt in 2016. Since then, he has cracked down on political opponents, curtailed press freedoms, and expanded his powers through constitutional changes. Venezuela presents perhaps the most dramatic example of democratic backsliding in recent years. Under Hugo Chavez and his successor Nicolas Maduro, what was once a relatively stable democracy has devolved into a near-totalitarian state. The government has undermined democratic institutions, manipulated elections, and used force to suppress dissent. These examples illustrate how democracies can be eroded from within, often gradually, as leaders exploit weaknesses in the system to consolidate power. They also highlight the importance of strong institutions and active civic engagement in sustaining democratic governance. The emergence of hidden dictatorships. While traditional forms of dictatorship are often characterized by overt authoritarian control, the 21st century has seen the rise of more subtle, hidden forms of dictatorship. These regimes often maintain the outward appearance of democracy, such as holding elections and allowing some degree of political participation, but in reality, they exercise a high degree of control over the state and its institutions. Characteristics of hidden dictatorships. Hidden dictatorships are characterized by a concentration of power in the hands of a few, the manipulation of democratic processes, and the use of state resources to maintain control. These regimes often justify their actions by claiming to protect national security, maintain social order, or promote economic development. Elections without choice. One of the hallmarks of a hidden dictatorship is the existence of elections that are not truly free or fair. In these systems, opposition parties may be allowed to participate, but they face significant obstacles, such as restricted access to media, harassment of candidates, and manipulation of electoral laws. As a result, elections serve more to legitimize the ruling party than to provide a genuine choice for the electorate. Control of media and information. Another key feature of hidden dictatorships is the control of media and information. While these regimes may allow some degree of press freedom, they often exert significant influence over major media outlets, either through ownership, regulation, or intimidation. This control allows them to shape public perception, suppress dissent, and promote their own narratives. Suppression of civil society. Hidden dictatorships also tend to suppress civil society organizations that could challenge their authority. This can include restrictions on NGOs, harassment of activists, and the creation of government-controlled organizations that serve to co-opt or neutralize independent voices. Examples of hidden dictatorships. Countries such as Russia, China, and some Gulf states offer examples of hidden dictatorships in the modern world. These regimes maintain the outward appearance of legitimacy and often engage in international diplomacy and trade, but they exercise a high degree of control over their populations and limit genuine political participation. In Russia, Vladimir Putin's government has maintained a semblance of democracy through regular elections, but these elections are heavily manipulated to ensure the dominance of the ruling party. The government also exerts significant control over the media and has cracked down on civil society organizations that challenge its authority. China presents a different model of hidden dictatorship, where the Communist Party maintains strict control over the state and society while allowing for some degree of economic liberalization. The government closely monitors and censors information, suppresses dissent, and ensures that the party remains the ultimate authority. Gulf states, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, offer examples of monarchies that function as hidden dictatorships. While these states have modernized in many ways and engage with the global community, they maintain strict control over political life and suppress any form of political opposition. Philosophical comparisons. Democracy versus dictatorship. As we delve deeper into the philosophical comparisons between democracy and dictatorship, it's essential to understand the core values and principles that underpin these systems. Democracy and dictatorship represent two fundamentally different approaches to governance, each with its own set of strengths, weaknesses, and philosophical justifications. The philosophical foundations of democracy. Democracy, in its most idealized form, is rooted in the principle of popular sovereignty, the belief that the ultimate authority in a society rests with the people. This idea has its origins in the political philosophies of ancient Greece, particularly in the works of thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. However, the concept of democracy was significantly refined during the Enlightenment by philosophers such as John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant. John Locke's social contract. Locke's idea of the social contract is foundational to modern democratic theory. He argued that individuals' consent, either explicitly or implicitly, surrendered some of their freedoms in exchange for the protection of their remaining rights by the state. For Locke, the legitimacy of any government rests on its ability to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. If a government fails in this regard, the people have the right to revolt and establish a new government. Rousseau's general will. Rousseau expanded on the social contract theory by introducing the concept of the general will, which represents the collective interest of the people. According to Rousseau, true democracy is achieved when the laws and policies of a society reflect the general will of its citizens, ensuring that all individuals are both authors and subjects of the laws that govern them. Kant's moral autonomy. Immanuel Kant emphasized the importance of individual moral autonomy within a democratic framework. For Kant, democracy is the only form of government that respects the moral agency of individuals, allowing them to act according to their own reason and principles. Kantian ethics, with its focus on duty and the categorical imperative, supports the idea that democratic laws should be based on universal principles that can be willed by all rational beings. The philosophical justifications for dictatorship. While democracy is often seen as the morally superior system, certain philosophical traditions have offered justifications for dictatorship, particularly in situations where stability, order, and rapid decision-making are deemed necessary. These justifications are often rooted in the idea that certain individuals or groups possess superior knowledge, wisdom, or virtue, making them better suited to rule than the general populace. Plato's philosopher king. One of the earliest philosophical defenses of dictatorship comes from Plato's Republic, where he argues that the ideal ruler is a philosopher king, an individual who possesses both the wisdom and virtue necessary to govern justly. Plato was skeptical of democracy, viewing it as a system that allowed the ignorant masses to make decisions that should be left to the wise. In his ideal state, the philosopher king would rule not for personal gain, but for the benefit of all, guided by knowledge of the forms, especially the form of the good. Machiavelli's Realpolitik. Niccolò Machiavelli, in The Prince, presents a pragmatic justification for autocratic rule. Machiavelli argues that the primary goal of a ruler should be the stability and security of the state, even if this requires morally questionable actions. He contends that in certain circumstances, a ruler must be willing to act ruthlessly, employing deceit or force to maintain power and protect the state from internal and external threats. This perspective aligns with the idea that in times of crisis, a dictatorship may be necessary to ensure survival. Carl Schmitt's sovereign dictatorship. In the 20th century, the German legal theorist Carl Schmitt provided a more contemporary justification for dictatorship in his concept of the sovereign dictatorship. Schmitt argued that in times of emergency, normal legal and constitutional processes might be inadequate to address existential threats to the state. In such situations, a sovereign, often in the form of a dictator, must have the authority to suspend the law and take extraordinary measures to restore order and protect the state. Schmitt's ideas, however, have been highly controversial and associated with the justification of totalitarian regimes. Strengths and weaknesses of each system. From a philosophical standpoint, both democracy and dictatorship have inherent strengths and weaknesses that reflect the trade-offs between collective decision-making and centralized authority. Strengths of democracy. Legitimacy. Democracies derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, making them more likely to enjoy broad-based support and stability. Protection of rights. Democracies are typically better at protecting individual rights and freedoms, as power is distributed and checks and balances are in place to prevent abuses. Innovation and adaptability. The diversity of perspectives in a democracy can lead to more innovative solutions to complex problems, as different ideas are debated and tested. Weaknesses of democracy. Inefficiency. The democratic process can be slow and cumbersome, particularly in times of crisis, when quick decisions are necessary. Populism and demagoguery. Democracies are vulnerable to the rise of populist leaders who exploit public emotions and prejudices for personal gain, often at the expense of long-term stability. Short-term focus. Democratic leaders, facing regular elections, may prioritize short-term gains over long-term planning, leading to suboptimal policy decisions. Strengths of dictatorship. Decisiveness. dictatorships can act quickly and decisively, particularly in times of crisis, as decision-making is centralized and not subject to lengthy deliberative processes. Stability. A dictatorship can provide stability in situations where democratic processes have broken down, preventing further chaos or conflict. Long-term planning. Without the pressure of elections, dictatorships can focus on long-term goals and policies, potentially leading to sustained development. Weaknesses of dictatorship. Lack of legitimacy. Dictatorships often suffer from a lack of legitimacy, as their authority is imposed rather than derived from the consent of the governed. Suppression of rights. Dictatorships are prone to suppressing individual rights and freedoms, as dissent is viewed as a threat to the regime. Corruption and abuse of power. With few checks and balances, dictatorships are susceptible to corruption, nepotism, and the abuse of power, often leading to widespread suffering and injustice. Freedom under different regimes. Freedom is a central concept in political philosophy and is often seen as the defining feature that distinguishes democracy from dictatorship. However, the nature of freedom varies significantly depending on the regime in question, and understanding these differences is key to evaluating the moral and political legitimacy of each system. Freedom in democratic systems. In democratic societies, freedom is typically understood in both negative and positive terms, drawing on the philosophical distinctions made by Isaiah Berlin. Negative freedom, or freedom from, refers to the absence of external constraints or interference in an individual's actions. In a democracy, this is manifested in the protection of civil liberties, such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press. These freedoms are safeguarded by laws and institutions designed to prevent the government or other powerful entities from infringing on individual rights. Positive freedom, or freedom to, refers to the capacity of individuals to act autonomously and achieve their potential. This concept is closely associated with the idea of empowerment and the provision of opportunities for individuals to participate fully in the political, economic, and social life of their community. In a democracy, positive freedom is often supported by policies that promote education, economic equality, and social welfare, enabling individuals to make meaningful choices about their lives. Freedom in dictatorial regimes. In dictatorial regimes, the concept of freedom is often more limited and is typically understood in terms of collective or national goals rather than individual autonomy. Restricted freedom. In most dictatorships, negative freedom is severely restricted. The state imposes constraints on individuals' actions, particularly in areas that might threaten the regime's stability or authority. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly are often curtailed, with dissenting voices silenced through censorship, imprisonment, or violence. State-controlled freedom. Some dictatorships may promote a form of positive freedom, but this is often defined in terms of the state's objectives rather than individual autonomy. For example, a regime might emphasize freedom from poverty or illiteracy as part of its national development agenda, but this is achieved through top-down, state-controlled initiatives that leave little room for individual choice or dissent. The state may argue that these restrictions are necessary to achieve greater social or economic goals, framing freedom as a collective rather than individual endeavor. Illusion of freedom. In some cases, dictatorships create the illusion of freedom through controlled or manipulated elections, state-sponsored media, and the co-option of civil society. These measures are designed to give the appearance of legitimacy and popular support while maintaining strict control over political and social life. The role of civil liberties. Civil liberties are a critical component of freedom in democratic societies, providing the legal and institutional framework that protects individuals from arbitrary interference by the state. These liberties include not only the rights to free speech, assembly, and press but also protections against unlawful detention, torture, and other forms of state violence. In contrast, civil liberties are often non-existent or severely restricted in dictatorial regimes. The absence of an independent judiciary, free press, or opposition parties means that individuals have little recourse against state abuses. This lack of protection creates an environment of fear and repression, where individuals are unable to exercise their rights or challenge the government's authority. contemporary global challenges. The 21st century presents unique challenges to both democracy and dictatorship, influenced by globalization, technological advancements, economic inequalities, and shifting power dynamics. These factors have reshaped governance, leading to new forms of political systems that blur the lines between democracy and dictatorship. Globalization and governance. Globalization has created an interconnected world where the actions of one nation can have far-reaching impacts on others. This interconnectedness has challenged traditional notions of sovereignty and governance, as global markets, multinational corporations, and international organizations exert influence over national policies. Democracies must navigate these pressures while maintaining their commitment to the will of the people, often leading to tensions between global economic demands and domestic political accountability. Technological influence. The rise of digital technology and social media has revolutionized communication and information dissemination, but it has also created new challenges for governance. In democracies, social media platforms have become battlegrounds for political influence, where misinformation and polarization can undermine democratic processes. In dictatorships, these technologies are often harnessed for surveillance and control, enabling governments to monitor and suppress dissent more effectively. Economic inequality. Economic inequality has become a defining feature of the 21st century, exacerbated by the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. This inequality poses significant challenges to both democratic and dictatorial regimes. In democracies, growing inequality can lead to social unrest, decreased trust in institutions, and the rise of populist movements that challenge the status quo. In dictatorships, economic disparity can fuel discontent and resistance, threatening the stability of the regime. Shifting power dynamics. The global balance of power is shifting, with emerging economies and regional powers challenging the dominance of traditional Western democracies. This shift has led to the rise of alternative models of governance, where authoritarian regimes present themselves as viable alternatives to liberal democracy. Countries like China and Russia have promoted their governance models as more efficient and stable, appealing to nations dissatisfied with Western-style democracy. The erosion of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, once considered the pinnacle of governance, is facing an existential crisis. The erosion of democratic norms, the rise of illiberal democracies, and the increasing influence of authoritarian regimes have called into question the future of liberal democracy. In many countries, democratic institutions are being weakened, and civil liberties are under threat, leading to concerns about the resilience of democratic systems in the face of these challenges. Hybrid regimes and the blurring of lines. The 21st century has seen the emergence of hybrid regimes that combine elements of both democracy and dictatorship. These regimes often maintain the facade of democratic processes, such as elections and political parties, while exercising authoritarian control over key institutions. This blurring of lines has made it more difficult to categorize political systems and has led to new forms of governance that challenge traditional definitions of democracy and dictatorship. The future of democracy and dictatorship. As we look to the future, it is clear that the concepts of democracy and dictatorship will continue to evolve, shaped by the complex and rapidly changing world in which we live. While it is impossible to predict the exact trajectory of global governance, several potential trends and scenarios can be considered. The resilience of democracy. Despite the challenges it faces, democracy has shown remarkable resilience throughout history. Democratic systems have the ability to adapt and reform, responding to changing circumstances and emerging threats. The future of democracy may involve new forms of participatory governance, where technology enables greater citizen involvement in decision-making processes.
Additionally, the rise of global civil society and transnational networks may help to strengthen democratic norms and promote accountability on a global scale. The persistence of dictatorship. While democracy may adapt, dictatorship is also likely to persist in various forms. Some regimes may continue to evolve into more sophisticated forms of authoritarianism, using technology and propaganda to maintain control while avoiding the overt repression that characterized earlier dictatorships. However, the inherent instability of dictatorial regimes, driven by the concentration of power and the suppression of dissent, suggests that they may remain vulnerable to internal and external pressures. New models of governance. The future may also see the emergence of new models of governance that challenge the traditional dichotomy between democracy and dictatorship. These models could draw on elements of both systems, creating hybrid forms of governance that are more responsive to the needs of a globalized world. For example, a system that combines democratic participation with technocratic expertise could address the complexities of modern governance while avoiding the inefficiencies of traditional democratic processes. The role of technology. Technology will play a critical role in shaping the future of governance. The potential for digital democracy, where citizens participate directly in decision-making through online platforms, could revolutionize how we think about democracy. However, the same technologies could also be used to enhance authoritarian control, as governments employ artificial intelligence, big data, and surveillance tools to monitor and influence their populations. Global governance and the challenge of sovereignty. The increasing interconnectedness of the world raises questions about the future of sovereignty and the potential for global governance. Issues such as climate change, pandemics, and international security require coordinated global responses that transcend national borders. This could lead to the development of new forms of governance at the global level, where nation-states cede some degree of sovereignty to international institutions. However, such developments may also provoke resistance, as states and citizens seek to preserve their autonomy and control over their own affairs. Ethical considerations and the search for justice. Finally, the future of democracy and dictatorship will be shaped by ongoing ethical debates about justice, equality, and human rights. Philosophers, political theorists, and activists will continue to grapple with the moral implications of different governance systems, seeking to balance the demands of order and security with the imperative to protect individual freedoms and promote social justice. These debates will be critical in shaping the values and principles that guide the evolution of governance in the 21st century and beyond. The paradox of modern democratic elections. As we delve deeper into the modern practice of democracy, particularly in countries often regarded as beacons of freedom, such as the United States, critical questions arise about the true nature of electoral freedom and the effectiveness of democratic participation. Is voting in modern democracies truly an exercise of freedom? In theory, democratic elections represent the epitome of freedom, where citizens exercise their right to choose their leaders and influence the direction of their government. However, this ideal is increasingly called into question. The concentration of media power, the influence of money in politics, and the strategic manipulation of electoral boundaries through practices like gerrymandering raise concerns about whether these elections are genuinely free or merely controlled exercises that limit true democratic choice. Voters are often presented with a narrow range of options, influenced by the interests of powerful elites, leaving little room for genuine alternative voices to emerge. Are the people truly the choosers? Socrates famously questioned the wisdom of the masses in his critique of Athenian democracy, and this skepticism remains relevant today. In modern democracies, particularly in the United States, the question persists: are the people genuinely in control of their government, or are they merely participants in a predetermined system where choices are shaped by external forces? The rise of political polarization and the use of sophisticated algorithms to target voters with tailored messages further complicate the notion of free choice, leading to a situation where elections may reflect the influence of powerful interests more than the genuine will of the people. Do people truly understand democracy, and is it valued? Socrates also raised doubts about the average citizen's understanding of complex political matters, suggesting that democracy's effectiveness is undermined when the electorate lacks the knowledge to make informed decisions. In today's fast-paced, media-saturated environment, where misinformation and superficial narratives often dominate public discourse, this concern is more pertinent than ever. The value of elections in such a context becomes questionable. Can an election truly be considered a meaningful exercise of democracy if the electorate is not adequately informed or engaged? The Socratic critique of modern elections Socrates' critique of democracy centered on the idea that without philosophical wisdom, the masses are ill-equipped to govern themselves effectively. Applying this critique to modern democratic elections raises troubling questions about the depth of public understanding and the integrity of the electoral process. If elections are to serve as a genuine reflection of the people's will, there must be a concerted effort to ensure that voters are not only free to choose, but also capable of making informed, meaningful choices. These questions highlight the paradox of modern democratic elections. While they are celebrated as the cornerstone of freedom, the reality is often more complex, with significant challenges that undermine the very principles democracy is meant to uphold. As we reflect on these issues, it becomes clear that the future of democracy depends not only on the preservation of electoral processes, but also on the cultivation of a politically educated and engaged citizenry. The exploration of democracy and dictatorship in the 21st century reveals a complex and dynamic landscape, where the boundaries between these systems are increasingly blurred. While democracy remains the preferred form of governance for many, it faces significant challenges that threaten its stability and effectiveness. At the same time, dictatorship in its various forms persists as a powerful force in global politics, often presenting itself as an alternative to the perceived weaknesses of democracy. As we navigate this evolving landscape, it is essential to critically examine the philosophical foundations of these systems, understanding not only their historical origins, but also their contemporary manifestations and future possibilities. By doing so, we can better appreciate the strengths and weaknesses of each system and work towards a future where governance is more just, equitable, and responsive to the needs of all people. In the end, the future of democracy and dictatorship will depend on the choices we make as individuals and societies. Will we rise to the challenge of renewing and reforming democratic institutions, ensuring that they remain resilient in the face of new threats? Or will we succumb to the temptations of authoritarianism, trading freedom for the promise of security and stability? The answer to these questions will shape the course of history in the 21st century and beyond. Thank you for joining us on this deep exploration of democracy and dictatorship. If this discussion sparked new thoughts, we encourage you to continue questioning and exploring. Subscribe to FactUp Realm for more insightful analyses, and let's keep the conversation going. Remember, true understanding begins with questioning the world around us.